Chaos outside. Our script reading today is from Matthew 5, and we're just going to read one verse, Matthew 5 and verse 20. Matthew 5 and verse 20. So this is Jesus speaking. For I tell you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven. So I heard a story recently. This is one of those stories, I'm not sure if it's urban legend or actual truth, factual. I looked into it a little bit more and it sounds like it was factual, but it's about in World War II how the Germans meticulously built a fake airfield occupied in Holland, complete with like hangars and oil tankers and planes, gun placements, everything, all out of wood. So they just built this whole thing. And this was an effort to fool pilots of the Royal Air Force and the Allied forces into targeting a decoy rather than the real thing. So they built this elaborate, airfield, so then they would bomb that instead of bombing the actual airfield, so they would keep their airfields intact. And the story suggests that the German forces took such a long time to complete the project that the Allied reconnaissance pilots actually knew about this and they just let them do it. Yeah, go ahead. They found out about it. And they had ample time to observe what was happening. They took photos. They knew exactly what was going on, and they just let them build this fake this airfield out of wood. And once they found out about the fake airfield, they actually decided to cross the channel, the English Channel, circle the fake airfield, and dropped a large wooden bomb in the middle of the airfield that said "wood for wood" written on it. So they told them they figured it out. So the idea being that things aren't always what they seem to be. It might look like something, but it's fake. It might just be built out of wood in this sense or in this story. And people do this as well. They could put on like a false front. They put on this false front where they want to portray an image, but it's not actually truth. It's not actually what they are inside. And Jesus in our script reading today, and on the Sermon on the Mount, warns about a group and refers to a group that is doing the same thing. They're putting on this false front, but that's not truly who they are. And he does this in the Sermon on the Mount. We're about to enter into how he's contrasting different things. He's contrasting the righteousness of the kingdom of heaven, which is the church, the people who have put Jesus on as their Lord, and contrasting the righteousness of the kingdom with the application and interpretation of the old law of Moses. And he does this with this strong warning with those who would enter into the kingdom of heaven. So again, back in Matthew 5:20 in our script reading, Jesus warns them that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven. So he's referring to this group of people and saying, unless you're more righteous than them, you're not going to enter the kingdom of heaven. So a strong warning. And I think to appreciate and apply what Jesus said to our lives, it helps to define what is this righteousness of the scribes and the Pharisees, of the teachers of the law and Pharisees that's being talked about here. Who are these people that he's referring to? And we'll get into that, and we'll see how they were putting on this false front. They had this image that they wanted to portray, but it wasn't truthfully what they were inside. So who were the Pharisees and the teachers of the law? The Pharisees were an influential religious sect within the Jewish religion at the time. They had a lot of influence on the people around them. They were known for their emphasis on piety and being holy. The Pharisee, or the word Pharisee, actually comes from a Hebrew word meaning separated. So kind of called out or called apart from that group in the sense of we are the really holy ones, out of all these Jewish people. We're separated out as being extra holy in that sense. And they were known also for their acceptance of oral tradition in addition to the written law. So they have the written law that's given to us in the Old Testament that they followed at the time. Then they added on a whole bunch of other stuff on top of that and said, everybody's got to follow this as well. If you're going to be a Pharisee, if you want to be truthful to God, you have to do all these other things that we were telling you to do as well. They were known as being some of the more religious conservative people at the time, so people who really wanted to follow what God said, or at least putting on that image of wanting to follow what God said. And so it might have seemed strange at the time for Jesus in his Sermon on the Mount to actually tell you, or tell the audience there, and in a sense tell us as we read the scriptures, that we are to exceed the righteousness of this group of people who are supposed to be the holy ones. So wouldn't it make more sense for Jesus to say, be like the Pharisees, because they are the really holy ones that are around? So it might have been a little bit surprising, to the audience at that time for them to hear this from Jesus saying that, okay, we're not supposed to be like these holy people at the time. I think for us, we have the benefit of reading the whole New Testament, so we know what Jesus is talking about because we're going to go ahead in a few passages and kind of see what he's talking about. But if they were in the group hearing this at that time, it might have been kind of a surprising thing. You go to Matthew 23. We're going to go to a passage that's known as, the woes of the Pharisees. We're not going to go through the whole thing. We're just going to look at a couple. And I guess in a sense, we're going to describe the righteousness, and again, maybe that's in quotes in a sense, of the scribes or the teachers of the law and the Pharisees, and kind of see some of the qualities that Jesus was saying that you shouldn't be partaking or following of this group of people. Matthew 23, verses 1 to 4. This is a passage that shows that this group of people were known to say and do not. They said one thing, but they did a different thing. Matthew 23, verses 1 to 4. Then Jesus said to the crowds and to his disciples, "The teachers of the law and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. So you must be careful to do everything they tell you. But do not do what they do, for they do not practice what they preach. They tie up heavy, cumbersome loads and put them on other people's shoulders, but they themselves are not willing to lift a finger to move them." So here we have a characteristic of this group of people. One thing I always like to point out when we're talking about the Pharisees is it is, in a sense, a generalization. There's lots of Pharisees that are in the New Testament that did turn around to become Christians. They did have the heart to follow God. But this group that he's talking about is, in essence, the ones that are actively against Christianity. So at the time Jesus was saying this, that might have included what these are doing. But in this passage, in verse 3, he says, "So you must be careful to do everything they tell you." And what he's saying there is that they are teaching the law of Moses. So when they're teaching you the law of Moses, make sure you do that. Follow the law of Moses. But don't do what they do. Don't follow them as people. That is what they preached. The term for that we often use is hypocritical. They are saying to do one thing, but doing an opposite thing. If you go to Matthew 23, we'll jump down to continue on with verses 5 to 7. This touches on their motivation for doing what they do. Matthew 23, verses 5 to 7. "Everything they do is done for people to see. They make their phylacteries wide and the tassels on their garments long. They love the place of honor at banquets and the most important seats in the synagogues. They love to be greeted with respect in the marketplace and to be called rabbi by others." So another characteristic of this group of people is they love glory. They want, they were called the Pharisees to be kind of the holy people out of the group of the Jewish people, and they love to be known as that as well. To kind of be recognized with all of this. If you're not sure what a phylactery is, it's a little small box that contains scriptures, and it's referred to in the Old Testament at times. And they bind it like to their head or their arms. But again, it's kind of a visual thing to kind of show this is how holy I am because I'm wearing these things. And it seems like they also made them like extra big. They made their phylacteries wide, so the really big things that they could wear to show how holy they are. Mine's bigger than yours, so I'm more holy than yours, I guess, in that respect. So they wore these religious garments. Their tassels were long, the phylacteries wide, and that separated themselves from others. As the word suggests, the Pharisee, the Hebrew word suggests that they called it Pharisees. And they loved those titles, the titles of honor, the places of honor, and the banquets. So that this points to their motivation. They love the glory of this position rather than actually trying to please God. They're trying to please themselves more than pleasing God. Okay, still in Matthew 23, we'll go down to verses 23 and 24. So Matthew 23, 23 and 24. "Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You give a tenth of your spices, dill, mint, and cumin, but you have neglected the more important matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faithfulness. You should have practiced the latter without neglecting the former. You blind guides, you strain out a gnat but swallow a camel." So again, in their case, they would emphasize the lighter matters of the law while neglecting the weightier commandments. And again, back to their motivation where they're trying to please themselves, that probably played into it a little bit. They wanted to follow these ones and they wanted other people to follow these ones because maybe it benefited them. And then these other things that justice, mercy, and faithfulness, maybe that was more difficult for them to control, so then they just didn't worry about those things. So they're forgetting about the large part of the law and really focusing in on these narrow things. The phrase that I think of when I see this is they couldn't see the forest for the trees. They're looking at all these little tiny details with a microscope that they missed the big picture. So they're looking at all of these, the tenth of your spices, mint, dill, and cumin, these little tiny laws, and they're forcing that on everybody else, but they're missing the whole point of God's mercy and God's justice and God's faithfulness. And that's one thing that they did. They're so focused on these minor details of the law that they forgot the important matters. If we go to another book, if you go to Luke chapter 16, there's actually a parallel passage of the Sermon on the Mount, but it expands a little bit, so we're going to read this one right now. This again shows one of the Pharisees' characteristics, what their motivation was and what they really loved. They loved glory and they loved money as well, as we're going to see in this passage. So Luke 16, verses 13 to 15. No one can serve two masters. Either you will hate one and love the other, or you'll be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. The Pharisees, who loved money, heard this and were sneering at Jesus. He said to them, "You are the ones who justify yourselves in the eyes of others, but God knows your hearts. What people value highly is detestable in God's sight." So your version might say, you cannot serve both God and mammon, might be the other word. And really that's just a biblical term for riches, for wealth. Those words are used generally, and mammon's used generally in kind of older translations, the King James and that sort of thing. And a lot of the more current ones, it's usually translated as riches or wealth or money, that sort of thing. But it's showing in this passage that you can't have that divided attention. And that's one quality that they had. They were focused on money. They were focused on trying to get this material gain in their lives. Again, we saw earlier that they're focused on getting glory, and they're also focused on kind of getting this wealth and these riches. They thought that they could justify themselves in doing this. And that's, again, one of those qualities that Jesus is saying, don't follow this. They might be teaching the law of Moses, but they're really focused on just getting some cash. That's what their motivation was at the time. So this was the level of righteousness that the scribes and the Pharisees had as a group. And that's why the kingdom of heaven, or citizens of the kingdom of heaven, their righteousness must exceed that righteousness. Again, there's times where the Pharisees would be teaching the true law of Moses, and that's something that they had to follow at the time. They did recognize that's from God, and they might have taught that, and you have to follow that, but you shouldn't be doing what they're doing. And these are the characteristics that should not be mimicked or imitated by the citizens of the kingdom of heaven. So, what are we supposed to do as citizens of the kingdom of heaven? So we're going to contrast these qualities with, we saw what we shouldn't be doing, what we're warned against doing, and now what should we do as citizens of the kingdom of heaven. Back to Matthew. Go to Matthew chapter 7 and verse 21. This passage still is in the Sermon on the Mount. And it really shows that we as Christians, as citizens of the kingdom of heaven, do have to practice what we preach. If we're saying that you're supposed to do something, we have to do this as well. Matthew 7, verse 21. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. We must have faith and belief in God. That's definitely a requirement. And in this passage, it's saying that has to go beyond just having that faith and belief and actually have to have the actions as well. You have to do the will of the Father who is in heaven. That's something that you must do. Another passage that I think really goes well with this is in James chapter 2. This whole passage in James 2 talks more in depth about how faith and action go hand in hand. It's funny how, we as people, try to separate those things too. Like say that you only have to have faith, it doesn't matter what you do, or maybe the other side of it where it doesn't matter what you believe, as long as you're following things and being obedient, that's all that you need. But in James 2, we'll look at verses 14 to 17. It really shows that they go hand in hand. It doesn't make sense to separate these two things. James 2, starting in verse 14. What good is it, my brothers and sisters, if someone claims to have faith but has no deeds? Can such faith save them? Suppose a brother or sister is without clothes and daily food. If one of you says to them, go in peace, keep warm and well fed, but does nothing about their physical needs, what good is it? In the same way, faith by itself, if it is not accompanied by action, is dead. So in this example that's shown in this passage, it shows that, well wishes are nice. These words are nice. Go in peace, keep warm, and be well fed. But it doesn't really help the situation at all. You can give people these kind of positive words, but we still need to have the actions that follow it. And this coupled with the passage we just read in Matthew 7, not everyone who says, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only those who do the will of the Father who is in heaven. That's what we need to do as citizens of the kingdom of heaven. The faith, the belief in God, having that dedication to God and being vocal about it is something that must happen. And along with that, we have to have the obedience as well. We have to follow what God says. We have to do his commands. We're not to be like the Pharisees who are just teaching people to do other things and then not doing it themselves. We have to contrast that with having the faith and the deeds as well. One thing that's important to note is that we are going to make mistakes along the way, but our goal should always to strive to be obedient. We're going to make mistakes, and that's where Jesus' blood forgives those mistakes. As long as we're obedient to him, his blood is going to continue to cleanse those sins. But we do have to strive to be obedient. We still have to strive always to have that faith and obedience that go hand in hand. Back to Matthew chapter 6. We'll look at verse 1. This passage is the one that contrasts the idea of doing things just for the glory of men. We saw that the Pharisees were doing that. That was one of their motivations for their actions. Matthew 6 in verse 1. Be careful not to practice your righteousness in front of others to be seen by them. If you do, you will have no reward from your Father in heaven. So the Pharisees practiced righteousness for the glory of those around them. But we are to practice righteousness for the purpose of serving God. We are to be obedient, out of gratitude, out of knowledge that he is saving us through his grace. And we have that faith, and since we have that belief, that's naturally going to flow into our actions, and that's going to be followed through with the things that we do in our lives. One thing that's, I think, interesting to point out is that in a previous verse, in a previous lesson, we talked about having our light shine before men. So we have our actions, we have our obedience, and that's something that people are going to see, people are going to recognize. But in this passage, it says, be careful to practice your righteousness, or be careful not to practice your righteousness in front of others to be seen by them. So is that a contradiction? No, it's more talking about the motivation behind these things. If you're doing these righteous deeds, if you're having your action reflect your faith, and it's pure and honest, and you're doing this because you are trying to serve God, that's something that people are going to recognize and see, and that's letting your light shine before others. But if we're contrasting this quality of just doing things for other people to be seen the way the Pharisees were doing it, where they were just trying to get God's glory and trying to stand out for people, but they didn't really have it in their hearts to please God. They just wanted those accolades from the people around them. If that's your motivation for being obedient, that's where you're starting to go astray. We have to make sure that we're practicing our righteousness to serve God. We're to let our light shine before others so they can see it. And our motivation behind that is because of our faith, is because of why God has given us his justice, grace, and mercy. We have to practice our obedience all the time. And that's where sometimes you can really tell, and you might be the only one who can actually see this, is are you doing the right things only when people are around, or are you doing it when you're all by yourself as well? When nobody can tell whether you're doing it one way or the other. If you're starting to see it in your life where you're only being good, in a sense, when people are around and not when nobody else is around, then that's when things are starting to slip. That's when you're starting to mimic the practices of the Pharisees, and our righteousness has to surpass that of the Pharisees. We have to make sure that we're obedient all the time, regardless of who is around or who isn't around. Go to Matthew 5 and verse 19. This is the passage that contrasts the idea of the Pharisees kind of following certain things but not others, kind of neglecting the things that they didn't like. So Matthew 5 and verse 19. Therefore, anyone who sets aside one of the least of these commands and teaches others accordingly will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever practices and preaches these commands, or practices and teaches these commands, will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. You know, the Pharisees focused so much on the details, the things that they wanted to focus on, and neglected the part of God's law that they didn't want to follow. And this passage is showing that we as citizens of the kingdom of heaven have to follow all of it to the best of our ability. If you go to 2 John 9, so that's 2 John, there's only one chapter in verse 9. So 2 John, verse 9. One thing that's interesting, the passage in Matthew 5 and verse 19 is referring to neglecting parts of the Old Testament law, the old law, because that's what was in force at the time. That's what we talked about in our last lesson. You know, while Jesus was on the earth, the old law was in force. And he's saying in Matthew 5:19 to make sure you follow the old law. That's what you need to follow. It's from God and you need to do it. And this same concept applies to the new covenant, to the new law. So after Jesus was crucified, ascended into heaven, the new kingdom was established, then we as Christians and citizens of the kingdom of heaven must follow all of the commands the same way that you had to follow all the commands under the old law. 2 John verse 9. Anyone who runs ahead and does not continue in the teaching of Christ does not have God. But whoever continues in the teaching has both the Father and the Son. To the best of our ability, we must follow all of Christ's teachings. We have to make sure not to strain a gnat and swallow a camel. You know, don't focus on those little nitpicky details to the point of forgetting the whole big picture. I guess it's important to point out, too, we still have to follow the details. It's not saying follow the big picture and ignore all the details. It's saying to not focus so much on the details that you miss the big picture. The idea is to follow all of it. That's the idea, is to make sure that we're looking at all of Christ's teachings, all the teachings in the New Testament, and again, to the best of our ability to follow all of those things. To be obedient, have our faith working into that obedience. I heard a story, this is back, I don't know who I heard this from, might have even been somebody in the room, I'm not sure, of them going to a friend's house, and they had a Bible, and they said, oh, they got a Bible here, and they popped it open, and there's actually Jiffy marker blacking out big sections of scriptures, you know, just blacking it right out, and they're like, what's going on here, why'd you do that? Oh, I didn't like that part, you know, so they just blacked it out. You know, it's something people do, and you almost do it sometimes without intention, but it does happen at times. You kind of gloss over the ones that maybe might be a little bit more convicting, or you might not think is as important. You know, we know the so-called big sins, you know, the murder and that sort of things that are big, that everybody else agrees that is bad too. You know, envy, lying, you know, these smaller sins that, again, you understand that they're not a good thing to do, but if you do them, it's more accepted by society around you, so you might try to let those slip. You might try to say, I don't really have to worry about that right now because it's not too severe. We have to make sure that we don't do that. We have to be, to the best of our ability, and following all of Christ's teachings. You know, everything that's involved in the New Testament scripture, we have to follow that to the whole. Back to Matthew 6 and verse 24. The last quality that we saw of the Pharisees was that they were lovers of money. They were really focused on the material world around them. Matthew 6:24. We read earlier the passage in Luke, and this is the one from the Sermon on the Mount from the book of Matthew, or the Gospel of Matthew. Matthew 6:24. No one can serve two masters. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you'll be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. We must be careful not to let materialism be our God. And again, that might be something that slips in over time. That might be something that's not something that you actually recognize is happening in your life. But when you start to recognize and start to see that maybe gaining money is taking priority over serving God or over doing things, and maybe that's starting to become more of the priority in your life, or focusing on gaining these material things, That's when you're starting to have your dedication or your devotion starting to split, and you're starting to be where you're trying to serve two masters. You're trying to serve this materialism and God at the same time. But we see in this passage that doesn't work. If you go to 1 Timothy chapter 6, this is a good passage that really talks in depth. The whole passage, this whole area of 1 Timothy talks about wealth and how dangerous it is. 1 Timothy 6, we'll look at verses 9 and 10. So 1 Timothy 6, starting in verse 9. Those who want to get rich fall into a temptation and a trap and into many foolish and harmful desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. Some people eager for money have wandered from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs. That's one subject in the New Testament that you'll see is very discussed. There's a lot of discussion about wealth and how dangerous it is and money. And again, like a lot of married couples, one of the biggest argument points that they have is about wealth and money and what you're going to do with the money. Money is a big part of our lives. And it makes sense because we're surrounded by it. We're physical beings. We're physical people who are surrounded by physical things. So it's hard not to get drawn into that physical world and putting all of your faith and all of your dedication in gaining those physical things, gaining that physical satisfaction in that way. But we see here that the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. Again, the money itself is not evil. The material world around us is not evil in that respect. But when you start treating that again as your God, you start splitting off your dedication from God to this idea of gaining wealth, gaining material things. That's a root of all kinds of evil. Once that starts getting in there, it starts to infiltrate through your whole life. And we are told to not let this happen, not let our attention be divided from serving God into serving these material things. So again, watch in your lives. Start recognizing to see that where you spend your time and attention is really where your dedication is. So if you start noticing in your life that you're spending your time and attention on gaining wealth or focusing on getting the next new thing, maybe for me it's the next new bike, or maybe Gary as well, buying another expensive bike. If you start really focusing all of your attention into gaining those things, that's when you know that your attention is starting to be diverted away from God. And we have to make sure that we spend that time studying the scriptures, serving God, focusing on doing what we can to serve him. And when we do that, we'll know that we are not serving mammon anymore. We're not serving money. We're serving God in our lives. So we've seen that our righteousness as citizens of the kingdom has to exceed the righteousness of the scribes and the Pharisees. It's something that they were a group of people at the time who were putting on that false front. They had this image of piety and religion. They wanted to be separated as more holy than the rest of the Jewish people. But Jesus was exposing them and showing that they truly weren't that righteous on the inside. They put on this image, but they actually didn't practice what they preach. They were trying to do things for the glory of man, not for God. They eliminated some teachings that the Old Testament was teaching and ignored those to try to focus on these other ones. And they focused on gaining material wealth. They loved money. And we see that we have to have our righteousness that is above that surpasses that. We do have to practice what we preach. If we're teaching things out of the New Testament, we have to do those things as well ourselves. We have to do things all the time. Make sure that we're obedient when nobody can see it. And we're doing this because we want to serve God, because we want to please him. We have to make sure that we practice all of Christ's teachings. The big ones, the little ones, the medium ones, the ones that you don't like. All of those things have to be a part of our life, and we have to strive to do our best to do those things and be obedient to those things all the time. And we have to make sure that this material world does not divide our attention away from God. Make sure that we're focused on serving him. This is a very high standard. It's something that Jesus did set out, something that was difficult and is almost essentially impossible for us to achieve on our own. But through God and through his help and through the sacrifice of Jesus, we can be seen as holy in his sight. And it does take obedience on our part and following that plan of salvation that's given to us in the scriptures. So I'd like to offer that invitation to those people who have not yet accepted Jesus on as their Lord. Maybe you believe in Jesus, you understand that he's there, but you have to have that faith side of things leading into obedience and have that obedience side as well and following the scriptures. We can show you in the scriptures how to do that, how to accept this gift that Jesus has offered and God has offered to everybody on the earth. And if you are a Christian who's struggling in any way, we are here to help. Again, that's part of the function of the church, this group of the called out who are here on this earth at this time. We're here to help each other through the struggles that we might have. So please make your needs known, and we'd love to help in any way that we can.